It all comes down to the ability to actually do something that is difficult and learn from it. We have a lot of young adults today that are really fragile, and a lot of that fragility comes out of the fact that we live in a culture that's being secular is divorced from the concept of eternal hope. There is no long-term sense that things are actually going to turn out positively, and therefore there is no reason to actually do something that's difficult in the short run because there's no sense that the long run is actually going to exist or going to be positive. Why do so in the first place? And the result is that young adults get out of the habit that they should be doing something that is difficult, and they end up kind of stalling out because the only way that you learn, the only way that you grow is by doing hard things. And with many young adults who get to days that we worked with primarily in both high school and post high school, they've never really been asked to do that before.
Hello, and welcome back to the Be Unbound podcast. I'm your co-host, David Rethemeyer.
And I'm your co-host, Jonathan Brush.
And we are joined today once again by Trent Emick, who is one of our team members. He's an admissions counselor for our team, and he is also just one of the most well-read and I would say just one of the most fascinating people to have interesting conversations with that we know. So, as always, we are delighted to have him joining us in the studio today as well. So, thanks for having us, Trent.
Yeah, it's happy to be here. Always fun conversations.
He's not only a admissions counselor, he's also one of our select speakers. So you're about to hear a professional go to work here. So we're looking forward to it, Trent. No pressure, man.
I mean, at this point, all I do is talk for a living. So, if I can't make it through 30 minutes with you guys, then that's a rather poor sign.
All right, David, that's definitely a challenge. I'm all ready. So what we're about to say is we're going to kick this off as I have a recalculation of how much stress we're going to put Trent under here.
Well, we wanted to take this opportunity to follow up a little bit on the episode that we just released recently, where we talked about just the state of college students today. Gen Z is going through college right now, and in the last episode, we talked about some pretty bleak observations that came not just from local colleges, but even from some of the Ivy League universities that are just indicating some really, really tragic things about the state of the average college student today. So if you haven't already listened to that episode, this episode is going to build off of that. So we would recommend you go and check out that episode. But if you have already listened to it, we wanted to follow up a little bit more on the 1% that we were talking about a little bit, because one of those articles mentioned that 99% of the students that are in a university that the professor writing one of those articles is talking about, 99% of the students are like this, and yet here in Unbound, where we work with dozens of students, hundreds if you're counting our high school programs, we really don't experience just about any of the problems that are outlined in those articles that we talked about. And so, Jonathan, I'll have you kick us off a little bit with just, you had some more observations. We've been talking about this as a team more since we recorded that episode of what makes our students part of that 1% and what some of the reasons might be behind that.
That's actually a really polite way of putting it, David. What David really meant to say is I've been ricocheting off the walls, vibrating, and smoke's coming out of my ears having read this article. And it's like become an obsession of thinking about it. Maybe some points of clarification, especially if you didn't listen to the previous episode, but just some important things to be on. So first of all, the person that wrote this article, and it's linked in the show notes, and so we absolutely recommend you go read this, pointed out that first of all, I thought he was a very honest reporter, and he obviously cared a lot and cared deeply about his students. And he was reflecting on, these are the frustrations. I would like to share this wonderful experience I had in college with my students, and I'm not able to because they have an inability to receive it. And then he went through to detail it. So it's important, especially if you've not read the article, to understand this is not a hit job on students. This is more of a lament. And honestly, that is where I'm coming from as well, is that it's frustrating to me to hear the kind of lack of opportunity, the lack of curiosity, the kind of crippling effect the students are going through. Secondly, while there's probably all kinds of things we could say here, this was less an indictment of colleges and more of an observation of what colleges were dealing with. Now, there's all kinds of reasons for that, but it's a more broadly cultural thing. And so I want to make sure that people listening here is that this is not a college bashing episode, nor was the one before. This is more of a reflection on the state of the students that are in a typical college classroom, which unfortunately is a broader problem. And then one last clarification. this professor put those indictments out there, and then the follow-up article, which we'll also link, he received a tremendous amount of views and feedback, and the 99% came from, he said 99% of teachers who responded agreed with me. And I was really intrigued by that, because that would mean that it's not so much the students we have the students in 1%, we're the 1% of teachers who don't have that experience, which is the same way as what David said it, but just for some clarity to actually state, that what we're saying here is that there's a really intriguing piece here that's happened, and that the students we deal with do not exhibit these same characteristics. Now, we'd love to take credit for that, but the point is they're coming in without those characteristics. And so that's been a really fascinating thing for us to go, why? Why is that? And so there's two things that we've been talking about, and we just want to share this. One is a point of encouragement. Well, I guess both those points of encouragement, and also that, understand this hypothesis, right? We didn't do a study here. We're just trying to reflect on what we're seeing and what we're experiencing, and measuring it against this experience, or against this professor's experience. So the first is, for various reasons that we won't get into in this particular episode, for various reasons, our students have a disproportionate amount of parental involvement in their lives. And so there's a lot of parental interaction with the students, a lot of back and forth between parent and child. And so, and it's both that and the fact that there's, I would say, more involved families and more involved parents across the board. Now, again, there's a whole bunch of reasons that would be a fascinating podcast we might do separately on that. But I point out primarily as a point of encouragement. In other words, parental involvement looks to me, from our kind of sliver of how we get the perspective of how we look at this, to be a major factor that allows students to completely buck a pretty broad trend. So that's pretty encouraging. The second is, and this one is a little bit more fascinating to me for a variety of reasons, and won't be a surprise to longtime listeners of the show, the majority of our students are homeschooled students. And it's very interesting that one thing you could say here is that if you have a broad cultural consensus and a cultural trend in terms of how students are experiencing educational, say at the elementary and secondary levels, and that's impacting them coming into the higher education levels, well, we have students who are not coming from that same cultural trend. In other words, they aren't subjected to that same amount of peer pressure and that same amount of cultural expectations, because their educational expectations are set primarily by their parents. So these two things are actually related. And so there's a really interesting thing to note here, that, okay, 99% of teachers experience this. We're in the 1% of teachers that don't. Our students have a completely different outlook than what 99% of teachers experience from their students. What are some of the common traits? Heavy parental involvement and a homeschooling environment that opts them out of the broad cultural consensus around lack of curiosity, lack of education, all those kinds of things that this professor was railing at. So those are some things that we've been having ongoing conversations about, and we wanted to share that as a follow-up. But now let's turn the corner once again and get our professional speaker here involved and make sure that we get him working here. And that is, there is still a universal reality here, which is the transition from young adult to adult, which we would argue takes place between like 12 and 18-ish, right? So the time period that we're generally working with our students in our SEND programs is always a difficult time. I think that's universally true, right? You're moving from one set of expectations to another. You're moving from your family that you grew up in culture to your own family, or your own being an individual, taking full responsibility for your life. That's always been a challenging thing. That's not new, right? And so the students that we deal with, even if they are perhaps the 1%, still have challenges, still have things they're struggling with. Some of those are universal, and some of those are unique to our culture. Trent's in this really interesting perspective, and I'll tee you up here, Trent. First of all, as a missions counselor, he talks to hundreds of students who are making these decisions. So that's a pretty interesting day-to-day reality of just interacting with people in this position. But I think what Trent brings as a perspective is really interesting, is a deep curiosity, a deep intellectual side, some really wide reading, and some really, I think, sharp, and I mean sharp as in positive, cultural analysis of what's going on. And so it's a unique kind of combination of like this practical talking to hundreds of families and students, and also this really insightful kind of deeper research background that Trent does, somewhat on our time and somewhat his own time. And so, Trent, what are some of the things that you're seeing in terms of, even students are like, okay, yes, they're engaged, they're interested, they want to learn, and yet they still have some struggles. They have some things that we see as some trends in terms of what they're asking questions about consistently.
Yeah, well, first thing, appreciate the positive tee up there. Makes my job here a little bit easier. I already won the audience over for me, so,
I
Perfect
need
MC word.
all the help you can get, Trent. Just trying
Exactly,
trying to battle on here. So.
Awesome. Yeah, no, there's a lot of different things, and I think all of us could talk about this for hours upon hours. And if we keep going deeper and deeper, we'll always have something new to say. But one of the biggest ones that I've been seeing recurring a lot more, both in just phone calls I have with people, talking to some of our own students, even just look at the culture widely, is it all comes down to the ability to actually do something that is difficult and learn from it. We have a lot of young adults today that are really fragile, and that happens in both the demographics of students that we're working with, that come from a more homeschool background, and also in the broader culture. It's definitely less so with our particular group of students, with the one percenters, but it's still there to some degree. And I've talked before about the idea that a lot of that fragility comes out of the fact that we live in a culture that's being secular is divorced from the concept of eternal hope. There is no long-term sense that things are actually going to turn out positively, and therefore there is no reason to actually do something that is difficult in the short run, because you are just then wasting away the time that you have that you would normally spend pursuing on something that makes you happy, something that gives you some sense of, a dopamine hit. And instead of doing that, you would normally do something that is difficult that actually pays off in the long run, but there's no sense that the long run is actually going to exist or going to be positive. Why do so in the first place? And the result is that young adults get out of the habit and out of the thought pattern that they should be doing something that is difficult. And they end up kind of stalling out, because the only way that you learn, the only way that you grow is by doing hard things, is by going out and testing your own skills, is by testing your own ideas and growing through that learning process. And with many young adults who get to base that we worked with primarily in both high school and post high school, they've never really been asked to do that before. They've had lessons fed to them by an authority figure, say a teacher, but they've never actually been asked to go out there and find something difficult to do and conquer that difficult thing. A lot of that comes from kind of the rise of our safetyism and how that came out of the baby boomer generation, and really actually all the way back to World War I, where progressively you've had generations start to insulate the next generation more and more as we become more wealthy as a society. And that's reached a point where now a lot of parents look at difficulty as something they don't want their kids to go through. And so they continuously shelter their kids until they just get to the point where they aren't capable of anything. So we get to this point now where, with kind of the gentle parenting movement, I think is probably the prime example of what's going on here, is these kids have kind of been coddled all their lives. And that results in this inertness, where then once you get to the point of having to figure out long-term direction and decide, okay, what do I want to do in the long run? How am I going to move into adulthood? How am I actually going to become autonomous? They're woefully ill-equipped because they have been reliant on somebody else to get everything for their entire lives. They've not been allowed to actually be individuals or be autonomous. And we have this weird expectation within our culture that somehow at 18 years old, it all is supposed to happen at once, or at least that's kind of how it's moved into recent years. And now we're dealing with the idea of prolonged adolescence, where now we're trying to push that date back further and further. But we look at it less as you slowly become an adult, and it turns more so into, oh, you graduate high school or you graduate college, somehow there's this magical transition, and there's no guidance there. And there's no actual connection from the educational process to the real world anymore. And that leaves a lot of kids bereft, leaves them in this point of kind of hopelessness, where they feel like they're getting to the point of adulthood, but they're staring at a sheer wall and they don't know where to go next. And you can't really just ask somebody you've never taught how to climb to actually just start scaling that cliff. And our thing within Unbound broadly with those kids is to tell them, hey, the way that you actually start to figure out long-term direction, the way that you start to become an adult, is doing it little by little by little. You do small projects, you learn from those projects, you figure out what you like doing, what you're good at doing, and then you take that and transition it to the next project and kind of scale it up over time. And through that process, you'll A, build resilience, B, you'll learn more about who you are and what you like doing, and C, you actually develop the skills, continuously do that at a high level over time as you continue to rinse and repeat through this process.
I actually think that this can be reflected in some trends that you see. You hear lots of times people complain about the advent of sort of all-consuming sports programs, so travel teams and those sorts of things. But I actually think that makes sense in a world that Trent explains here, because sports is one of those things that when it's all said and done, you have to actually do it on the field yourself, right? You can have great coaching, you can have great training, you can have all those advantages, but you still have to set the volleyball, you still have to make the tackle, you still have to hit the baseball, you still have to, train for tennis, you still have to swim the lap, you still have to run the cross-country race. And so when you see some of these travel teams and some of this sort of emphasis on sports, there's at some level a subconscious cultural reaction to trying to almost desperately grab something that's real, that does offer some challenge in a world that's kind of absent from. One of the things that maybe is important for us to observe here is that I have little patience for, discussions, podcasts, content, whatever, that rails against the problem. And so we try hard not to do that. And so if you're listening, what I want you to do is I want you to stick with us for a second, because it's essential for you to solve the problem, for you to understand the problem. And I think Trent's done a great job of succinctly wrapping together some important things. And maybe if I could just lift out those highlights, the two most important things, and Trent, you can correct me if you're wrong, is the absence of hope, right? Why would you do hard things if you don't have a transcendent hope? And so that lowers both people's, drive and ability to achieve. And then the absence of challenge, which is related to that, so that there's very few opportunities for them to get, quote unquote, real experiences that build this measure of confidence, especially in small doses over a lot of time. So they're in a very sheltered environment that tends to be quite artificial because of a significant amount of safety, desire for safety. And then there's not a transcendent hope that's pulling them out past that. So before I go any further, Trent, does that make sense? Anything you want to add to kind of, or did I miss something there?
Yeah, no, I think that articulates it really well. One added point here that I did not mention, but I do think is worth also adding, is we're also seeing this whole thing of kind of a race to the bottom. This, I think, particularly applies with public school students more than anywhere else, but it is nonetheless viewed our culture, where we tend to define what everybody should be doing based off of the lowest common denominator. And so the thought that triggered that with what you were saying is in sports, participation trophies, right?
Right.
We don't want to set the higher bar because that's going to alienate the people who are a little bit less capable. Instead, we've inverted it, and that just continually promotes that safetyism cycle.
I wonder, the theme that I'm seeing throughout pretty much all of these, to some extent or another, is just the expectations that are put on these young people. And there is an expectation that no matter what they do, they should have some sort of success. And if you don't think that you're going to have some sort of success, then you should just not do it at all. Because if you're going to go out and you're going to fail, failure is bad. So let's protect you from failure, and instead just place the expectation on things that we are confident will keep you safe and happy, and you won't experience your failure. You won't experience sort of like the negative sides of those things. I wonder if does that strike true as a common denominator there?
Yeah, I think so. And I think, to Trent's point of the participation trophies, that's the other reason that you have these travel teams, because, you want people they're sort of naturally reacting against that. They want some real competition. They want those kinds of things. If you add those things together, I think what we want to say is that, okay, that's an observable problem. And, if you're listening to this and you're feeling indicted or you're feeling despair, that's not the point. The point is that those problems come out of a good desire, right? I mean, Trent talked about going back to a World War I generation, right? Think about people who experienced the terrors and horrors of the Great War, the Depression, World War II, the Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam War. I mean, we're talking about a cataclysmic cultural forces here. And it is both rational and to some extent desirable and commendable that you have people that say, I don't want to do that. But those things start to add up. I want to provide a better situation I don't want my child to have to experience that. Those things add up over time to get us to this point where we have some significant problems from that. Okay, so if that's the observable problem, then I think the thing we want to turn here and sort of say with encouragement is that, knowing the problem, the solutions are not fiercely difficult. What's difficult is the fact that it's an insidious sort of cultural-wide expectation, so you have to kind of stop. And, we've got lots of people that are Narnia fans. You have to be Puddleglum in the cave, and you have to, stomp the fire, get the pain, and remember there's sunshine and you don't live in the shadow world, right? And if you get that reference, great, and you can clap yourself in the back, and if not, don't worry about it. I'll just keep going here. But the point here is that you need that kind of awakening, and that's the hard part. Once that happens, the next action is not particularly difficult. It's to do something that everybody kind of recognizes, which is if you want to help students become part of the 1%, the ones that do that, then it's as simple as challenging them and giving them opportunities to both succeed and to fail. And that's the part that, to Trent's point, we witness a lot in Unbound. But we don't have a corner in the market, and we didn't invent it. I mean, that's available to anybody who just backs up and recognizes it. And maybe that starts with recognizing that your desire to help becomes a hindrance if you're insulating your young adult from the ability to experience both failure and success.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's also something to be said here that the problems that we see young adults dealing with today, they're not necessarily new ones, right? These are issues that have been a part of young adulthood and just a part of life for all time. They just look a little bit different today because we've so rapidly advanced in technology in such a short period of time. I mean, when you're talking about the World War I thing, I was thinking about the fact that I knew a lady at my old church back in Missouri who was born in 1917. And she lived until 2021, I think. You think about what she saw across her lifetime. She went from basically just past horse and buggy days to Teslas. And so when we're trying to figure out what to do about these problems, so much of what we need to do is to look at the past and say, hey, they did have certain solutions here. And then how can we adapt that solution to modern day? So before we start recording here, one of the things you were talking about, Jonathan, is the fact that a lot of students today, they feel this lack of necessity because there's so many kind of, catches, things that are going to prevent them from actually falling completely flat and needing to pick themselves up off the ground. They have safety nets, I think is a better way to put it. And because there's so many safety nets, whether it's family or the fact that, we even just on a cultural level, we have a social safety net, and you have a lot more flexibility economically in our current day, so you can be a little bit more risky. You have a greater opportunity to go out and kind of procrastinate or to do things that are not as important. You don't feel like you have to do the thing that is going to immediately have the highest level of return. You can do that a little bit more kind of long-term investment. And so in the past, that was not the case because you needed to figure out the thing that was just going to feed your family immediately. And if you could figure that out, then that was going to be a thing that you invested in. All other options kind of went off the table immediately. And usually you only had one option on how to actually feed your family. And that was kind of pick up the career that your dad had, or if you're a woman, get married, have kids, but another guy who was going to provide for the family, right? And that's no longer the case today. And what's interesting, particularly from the young male's perspective, because that's what I am, is when you look out at young adults today, the young men who are succeeding to the greatest degree, that are thriving to the greatest degree, are all the ones who get married young, which I find to be kind of a fascinating statistic. And I think a lot of that comes out of a sense of necessity that has now been forced upon them of, okay, now I've got a burgeoning family that I need to provide for. And that sense of necessity is motivating and pushes them out to go and do something that is good and productive and to actually figure out what their long-term direction is, get a good job, whatever the case may be. Now, that's not to say, okay, young men, I'll go out and get married immediately. That's not a great idea. What this is to say is that there are certain ways that we can go out and develop some sort of sense of necessity in order to then give students a reason to go out and do the difficult thing, to go out and to learn and continue to grow.
I think one of the things that's exciting to me about, we go down these lines and we had talked about this a little bit offline. And so there's this imperative, right? You have previous cultures that had imperatives that force this transition. So there's always been a difficult transition. But if you were making this transition into adulthood during the Great Depression, you didn't have to think about what you were doing. There were very few options, and survival was really important, right? I mean, like, you were looking for work and any kind of work, and you had families to support, whether your extended family you just came from or your new family. And so that was, there wasn't a lot of decision making there. At other points in time, you were going off to war, or there were only certain career fields that were open to you, and so there was a necessity to get into those. So we have this kind of luxury that we live in a system that has what looks like, on first blush, kind of unlimited possibilities. And one of the things I think that is exciting that is not difficult in terms of, like, you don't have to be super smart, you don't have to know secret knowledge, you don't have to have super skills, but is difficult in the sense that it's different, is that one of the things you can do to help young adults is to pitch vision and create some imperative. And so, this is not imperative like, if you don't do this, you're going to starve to death. But this is imperative like, here's a good thing to strive for. And you talked, Trent just talked about marriage and certainly building families, but that's not a universal. So let's get onto a little broader thing. That what is a universal? What's a good thing? Building communities, creating something that's lasting, serving other people, contributing to, things, doing things more than those that came before you, being able to build on what you've been given. Those are things that are universally true through all of history. And before was almost helped by the surrounding options of what was going on. So that sort of fed into it. And now maybe requires a little bit more, being deliberate about pitching that vision, encouraging that, and holding that in front of people. The good thing is that when that happens in our collective experience, there's a response with a lot of hunger and appetite, right? People want real things to live for. They want meaningful things to do. They want big visions to strive for. And, we talk a lot about not big visions like, start the next unicorn company and become rich, famous, or powerful. Big visions like you're part of a grand story that does believe in a hope that eclipses all things. You live in a fallen world and you will have to experience struggles, and there's a hope that makes those struggles worth it. And there's a reason for you being here, and there's important things for you to do, and those things matter for eternity. Look, that's a big vision. It doesn't require any level of fame, fortune, or power. It requires you to deal well with the things that are in front of you and do the best that you can and know that they have repercussions and lasting impact beyond what you can see. That's pretty universal. I've never met anybody who doesn't respond to that in some fashion. And it's something universal, so we all understand it. So if you're the parent, this is not something that you have to learn something new to do. This is just a matter of delivering the challenge consistently, because that's what it takes for kids to kind of grasp on and run with that.
Oh, man. The other thing that I think it can just be encouraging too is that I think when I hear a message like what we've been talking about, the thing that kind of pops up in the back of my mind is just, well, there is also the other extreme that does exist of trying to not just create this bubble of safety and low expectations for children, but also just at the same time, not looking to overwhelm them with far too many expectations and putting too much pressure on them. And that definitely exists. There's a reason that we have swung to this point is because previously we swung to the other direction, and that's not any better. But I think that the freeing thing about what we're suggesting here is that I think the crucial part is that failure is not fatal. Failure is an option. And so we can look to all of these opportunities that we can give our young adults, and just with the huge amount of different opportunities and different interests and just accessibility to different worthwhile things that are worth pursuing that young adults have now, it is more freeing than ever to be able to just point your young adult in a direction, or like give them an opportunity and say, hey, pursue this, give it your very best shot. And if they succeed, that's awesome. And if they don't succeed, say, hey, you learned something really great from this. You learned, hey, maybe this part of it is what you were good at. This part of it is what you weren't as good at. And maybe it means trying again. Maybe it means, okay, maybe that's not your thing. What's the next thing that you can do now that you have done something? And so failure no longer becomes this thing to be afraid of, this source of anxiety and trepidation of, am I going to break my precious young human? And just an opportunity to say, oh man, this is just a young person who is so full of potential. Let's see what God has for them. Let's send them out and give them as many opportunities as possible to go and do amazing things. And they're going to get it wrong a lot of the time. But guess what? Most of us who are a good ways further along than they are also get it wrong a lot of the time. And they just have an opportunity to do that in a way that helps them to learn and to be in a much better position than the vast majority of their peers.
Well, if you're thinking, if you've been following this whole conversation, then, first, let's be aware of the problem. There is a wide cultural trend that is bending towards despair, and that is really frustrating to me personally, because when you read articles like the one we referenced, you just see a bunch of young people, and the despair is evident in this professor who writes it. He's not condemning young people. He's basically saying, I want so much more for them than they want for themselves, and that's tragic, because if they wanted it, I could help them get there. right? That's what I've given my whole life for. That's why I become a professor. And what do you do if you're a professor who wants to help people get someplace and find out they no longer want to go there? That's a pretty discouraging thing, right? And that's the part that I'm reacting against and saying, whoa, we've got a culture that is producing en masse people that are lethargic in that area. But yet there's hope because we don't deal with students like that. And so what is the difference there? Well, it's not, some sort of strange alchemy of like perfect knowledge and parenting, all that stuff. I think it breaks down to things that are relatively simple, but maybe harder to do because you have to be consistent in them. And those things are be involved in your students' lives, right? Be aware that if you take them out of the cultural trend like that, they'll have different standards. So if they're in the broad culture, those are likely the standards they're going to adopt. You need to probably take them out of that culture and put them in a different one. The most effective way we know to do that is homeschooling. There's other ways as well, but realize that that's a pretty big ask, right? That's not simple, but it is simple in understanding and what it does. And then, to build on what Trent has been talking about here, you want to add to that, create a level of expectation, put challenges in front of them. And then to David's point, we're not talking about, driving your kid into some sort of performance-based lifestyle. We're talking about to put challenges in front of them and realize that failure is an option and that experiencing that failure ends up being a really important part of what they learn to do. And that kind of comes back to, we're not talking about doing this because you're trying to create a superhuman. We're not trying to beat somebody in some sort of cultural competitive game. We're trying, as David so elegantly put, we're looking at young adults full of God-given potential. And as parents, as teachers, as educators, as adults, we should all be looking down, demographically speaking, in age, to those coming behind us and say, look at all this potential, and how can we help that God-given potential to spring up and take root and grow? And that's not about having demands that makes them performance-based. That's about extending grace and mercy and all those kinds of things. But it's also about saying like, hey, we want something better for you. Come on, let me call you to something higher. And when you trip and fall, let me dust you off and say, yep, I tripped over that root one time too. Let's take another step and let's continue heading up this mountain and see what the view is. That's the exciting part. That's the interesting part. And that's the part that we want to encourage you in terms of practical living. What do you do here? Well, understand the problem, have different expectations, exercise grace and mercy as you do that, and celebrate the fact that God gives us the opportunity. And look, one last thing. I just love to celebrate the fact that you can opt out of bad cultural trends. If you don't like where the culture's going, if you're looking for permission, we're giving it to you. You don't have to go there. You can do something different. And all three of us have various experiences, all different in terms of our lives, where we're like, yeah, we're not doing that. And we'll just tell you the water's fine. Come on in.
Oh, man. Well, Jonathan, for one thing, I think you're giving me a run for my money in terms of summarizing episodes well.
I learned from the best, David. I've been paying attention. I can be taught despite the advanced age here.
Well, and as we have been mentioning throughout this podcast, this is something we are extremely passionate about because we do it on a day in and day out basis. In fact, as we are going to be finishing up this podcast recording, I think all three of us are probably about to hop off of here and then go watch some of our Ascend students project showcases. If you're not familiar with our Ascend program, one of the things that we do is that we challenge them to take on a project every single year, and they have to come up with that project, and there is a huge variety of different things that they can do for that. But the point of it is it has to be something challenging that they have to put a significant amount of work in. They have to take ownership of it, and success or failure. And a lot of the times we've been listening to these project showcases, so a lot of the times they didn't turn out quite the way that they wanted to. But universally, it is one of the coolest parts of our jobs every year is to listen to some of these showcases and hear these students talk about how they wanted to take on something ambitious and they got support from their Ascend teams and from their community, and they were able to take it on and live that out. So if that's something that you think sounds interesting for your student or a student that you know, check out our website, beunbound.us, and you can learn more about Ascend, which is our higher education alternative program that I've just been mentioning. And we also have our high school programs, Equip and Explore. We are in the peak of our enrollment season right now, and slots are going quickly for all of our programs. So make sure to book an appointment soon. You might just have an opportunity to chat with Trent here and have a full conversation with him. And so we hope that you take advantage of that opportunity.
Yeah, we should do a better job of promoting that, David. I'm like, if you want to talk to the famous speaker Trent Emick, you can do it for free.
Yes.
By going to beunbound.us and scheduling an admissions appointment, and you can talk to him one-on-one directly, and he will be able to share his wisdom with you on that phone call. So, like, who would want to pass up an opportunity like that?
I think you're right,
oh,
Jonathan. We should be charging for these things.
Well, until next time, get on that website, go to have a conversation with Trent. Until we see you again, be unbound.
That should be a request that we should put into Riverside, is just whenever the countdown timer finishes, can there just be like some sort of like big explosion animation or something?
Yeah.